Good evening, all. I'm James. I'm one of the pastors here. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, thank you for your word. Please strengthen our minds to understand it. Please soften our hearts to delight in it. And strengthen me to speak it helpfully. Amen. Now, I know what you're thinking. If you came to the kids' service a few hours ago, you would have gotten puppets. But instead, we had this massive list of names. You have to try and work out, what do we do with this? Well done, Jemima, by the way. I owe you a chocolate or something afterwards. You did such a good job. And to us, this seems like a really weird way to start the Christmas story. Mostly because we don't know much of these names at all. There's even a guy in there called Salmon. Did you listen to him? That's his name, Salmon. But to the original readers, this list of names just builds so much anticipation for what's going to come next. Because they knew these people. They knew their stories and their histories and all the stuff that came with it. And this list tells one big, incredible story that stretches over 2,000 years of history before Jesus' birth. And its job is to hype up our expectations for what's going to come next, with the birth of Jesus, which we celebrate tomorrow. But in doing that, it also answers a big question we've all wondered at some point. And the big question is this: what is God doing in the world? How's he at work through all the brokenness and evil throughout history? Is he actually in control? Do we have a God that keeps his promises to his people? And what this passage shows us line after line, that through the brokenness of history, God still rules. And he fulfills every promise he's made in Jesus. God still rules, and he fulfills every promise he has made in Jesus. To keep things short for us tonight, I'm just going to focus on a few of these names. I won't go through them all. That means we're not going to cover everyone. And that's actually quite fitting, because this genealogy, this long list, also leaves people out. It's not a complete list. There's a pattern here, and you can see it's in chunks of 14. There was 14 between Abraham and David, 14 between David and the exile, and 14 between the exile and the Messiah. That's because the author has put these historical records into a format to make a theological point. He's curated a list. And what he's getting at is that this Jesus, the Messiah, just meaning God's chosen one, the King, is the key to all of it. He explains all of that history. And since the writer made it into 3 chunks, we're going to look at it in 3 chunks as well. And you can see them on your outline. You find it helpful to take notes. And so we're going to start with the beginning, the promised blessing. And it starts with a name maybe some of us have heard before. That's the name Abraham. And what's remarkable is God chooses this nobody, and he promises to make him a somebody. In fact, in Genesis 12, this is God speaking to Abraham. Well, he doesn't even get to be Abraham yet. He's still Abram. And he says this: "Go from your land, your relatives, and your father's house to the land that I will show you. I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I'll bless those who bless you, and I'll curse anyone who treats you with contempt. And all the peoples on earth will be blessed through you," or through your descendants. And he's going to give this fatherless man more children than there are stars in the sky. He's promising a nomad who goes from place to place in a tent to have his own promised land to settle down in. And lastly, he says that through him, or through his descendant, all peoples on earth, all of them, will be blessed. It's a remarkable promise for God to make to a man who's just there minding his own business. And all that way through, with Abraham and all the other names that come after it, we're constantly wondering, well, how's this going to work? Because God's people are often quite weak. They get scared. They run away. They disobey God, and they suffer for that. But God, in his dedication, and his this love that doesn't quit for them, and his great wisdom that knows every possibility, he still finds a way to keep his promises. And so I'm going to give you a super quick highlight reel on some of Abraham's kids. And I think it's going to make us feel better about how messed up your family gathering might be tomorrow when you hear a bit about their family as well. Because in verse 2, and if you have your outline there, we see Abraham fathered Isaac, and Isaac fathered Jacob. And Jacob's not a great brother. He cheats his brother out of his inheritance. But that can't stop God. And so he has Judah and other brothers as well, and they wanted to kill one of their brothers, Joseph, out of jealousy. But Judah, being the nicer one, he decides just to sell him as a slave instead. But that can't stop God. He's in control. So despite that, he uses the brother who became a slave to save the rest of the family from famine. In fact, to save all of Egypt from starving. And so the nation starts to grow. They have lots of offsprings. And so the Pharaoh's scared and decides to enslave them. And you're wondering how they're going to get out of this. But God is in control. And so he rescues them out of slavery. He brings them to the promised land. But then the people, they get scared. They don't want to go in the promised land. And so they just want to go back to Egypt as well. But God is faithful and he's in control. And he keeps them alive. And he holds their hand for 40 years in the desert until he's ready to go in to the promised land. And that brings us just up about to the time of our old mate Salmon, who in verse 5 has a child with a foreign prostitute. She ends up saving the day, by the way. We'll get to her at the end. With each of these names comes real stories of real people who make genuine mistakes. And they end up paying for them because it's their mistakes. But God's always committed to keep his promise to them despite their unfaithfulness. And sometimes there are real tragedies they have to work through just living in a world broken by sin. And even then, with every name, we see that God is still in control and he somehow makes a way to use it for the good of his people, even if they can't see it at the time. And so God made these great promises of land and nation and blessing to all people. And we get to see that he's faithful to that in this list of descendants. But God's people were still waiting to see who that blessing to the whole world would be. Because it wasn't Abraham. It wasn't Jacob. It wasn't Salmon. That promise is yet to be fulfilled. And they're just dreaming what that might look like. And that brings us to point 2, the promised king. Because in verse 6, things change. We get to King David, maybe one of those names you might be familiar with as well. He's pretty special in this list because he's the only one that's referred to as king. And he's a pretty remarkable guy. He truly loved God. He trusted God. And he was humble. He grew up as a shepherd. He was pretty fearless. He killed a giant, Goliath. He led on the front lines with his fellow soldiers and he wrote songs to God. And God makes this incredible promise to him in 2 Samuel chapter 7, that someone from his throne would rule forever. I have it up there on the screen for us, but I'm just going to read some bits of it. In verse 12, God says to David, "When your time comes and you rest with your ancestors, I'll raise up after you your descendant, who will come from your body, and I'll establish his kingdom. He is the one who will build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever." And then in verse 16, "Your house and kingdom will endure before me forever. Your throne will be established forever." It's another remarkable promise from God that he doesn't need to make. He promises that his people would have a king to lead them and protect them forever. Someone who might be humble like David, fearless, faithful to God. But there's a problem. And it comes in the next line in verse 6. We first hear him as King David, but then the rest of it, David fathered Solomon by Uriah's wife. David was not a perfect king. He sinned. He committed adultery with one of his soldiers' wives and arranged his death to cover it up. He failed God and his people, and he eventually dies. Because his sin, like all sin, it just destroys everything. It rips his family apart. It destroys his throne, kind of his legacy as well. and it even destroys his kingdom. And we're left wondering again, how's God going to keep this promise of a forever king when they all keep sinning, when they all keep dying? And who could be the one who's a blessing to the whole world, one that could actually rule forever, and that would be a good thing for God's people? And we keep wondering that as the nation just declines. Our kings go from bad to worse. The people themselves, they forget God's promises. They rely on other gods. The promised land is attacked first by Assyria and then by Babylon, and they're carried off into exile. They're taken away. No home, no throne, and they have no hope. And so have to live in a foreign land. They're there for about 70 years for most of them. And it's 70 years of mourning and grief and lament, just wishing that they could be home. And even when the exile in Babylon ends, and some of them do come back to their country, it's not the same. It's just this empty husk of what they remember. And so they're waiting. They wait 400 years in this shell of what used to be, the whole time thinking, has God deserted us? But they still had this tiny hope, this promised king from 2 Samuel, the Messiah who would one day come and would make things right. He would lead them back to their God and restore God's people. But after 400 years, there was nothing. And this has been the experience of God's people in a broken world. And I wonder if it might be yours as well. I know in a room this size, there's some of us here that are grieving the loss of someone this Christmas. It's not a happy time, it's a horrible time. Maybe some of us feel so far away from God that our nights are just filled of desperate prayers and cries, but we don't get any answers back, just silence. Perhaps you worry that your own sin means that God's just finally given up on you. Well, this too has been the experience of God's people. 400 years of waiting, wondering, what is God doing in this world? Where all they had was this promise of hope that one day God would send someone that would make everything right. A Messiah, a chosen one to restore God's people. That's the backstory we need to understand before we get to Christmas. And it's the backstory into which we read verse 16. Verse 16, and Jacob fathered Joseph, the husband of Mary, who gave birth to Jesus, who's called the Messiah. So all the generations from Abraham to David were 14 generations, and from David until the exile to Babylon, 14 generations, and from the exile to Babylon until the Messiah, 14 generations. And we're at our last point here where we see that the birth of Jesus is the end of exile for God's people. Because Jesus is the one who brings people back to their God. And what we'll go on to see in the rest of Matthew is that he's the fulfillment to all of these promises. That God's people had the promised land of Canaan. It was all right. But Jesus welcomes people into the kingdom of heaven for eternity. God's people had the nation of Israel as their people. At the end of Matthew, Jesus commands to his disciples to make disciples of all nations, all tribes, and all languages, welcoming everyone into his family. And we've been waiting for all people to be blessed through one of Abraham's kids, and Jesus is that descendant who can bring peace to the whole world by dealing with their sin and reconciling them to their God. Jesus is the promised king who's humble and fearless and faithful. A King David, he defeated Goliath for God's people. But at the cross, we'll see that Jesus defeats Satan, sin, even death itself for God's people. David sinned and he died. But Jesus never sinned and he rose to life again to rule perfectly forever. He still rules today. And if we read the last bit of this chapter, we see that Jesus is the end of exile because God is not silent. God is not far away from us. Because Jesus will be called Emmanuel. He is God come near. what God's people have been waiting for all this time is for Jesus. And what we have been waiting for all this time is Jesus. Because God still rules and fulfills every promise in him. And so if you are one of God's people here today, we have to remember that Jesus is the proof. He's the certainty that God reigns and he fulfills his promises. And I know we can doubt God is in control when life is uncertain. And looking at this list, it just runs in the family. That's the nature of being one of God's people. But we live 2,000 years after Christmas. We've seen what Jesus has done. So we look back to his birth and we look back to his death, and we just have to remember that if he faced all the opposition this world could throw at him, all of its power, all of evil, all of Satan, and he suffered death dealing with our sin, and then he got back up, raised from the dead, that means nothing could possibly stop God from fulfilling his promise to us. Nothing. What is there left to oppose him? And so when we suffer in this broken world, and we long for Jesus to return and make everything right, we can be fully confident that God still rules and he keeps his promises in Jesus. Because we are the latest names in this list. And like all the generations before us, we are called to wait patiently, trusting in God's faithfulness. And if you're not a follower of Jesus yet, if you aren't sure you're one of his people, well, there's an invitation for you here. Remember Salmon, that guy back in verse 5? Well, he fathered someone by Rahab, who was a prostitute in an enemy city to God's people. And some spies came in to scout out the place. And she heard about the God of the Bible. And she realized that he's the one who's in control. She feared him. And so she saved the spy's life. She saw God as the one in control, and she became one of God's people. And she's given such dignity that she's included in Jesus' own family line for all of history to see. Littered throughout this genealogy, we see that God's plan has always been to welcome people into his family who trust him, who rely on him. And we'll see that in the rest of Matthew as Jesus invites people to follow him as the one who can save them and lead them. And so this Christmas, you are given an invitation. We've heard that Jesus is the answer to all of God's promises. The question is, will you commit to finding out more about him? More about this Jesus who all of history revolves around. And so why not chat to someone who brought you tonight? Why not chat to me after this service tonight? You can come back tomorrow for Christmas, join us on Sunday, or do whatever you can to come to the life course coming up next year. But finding out more about Jesus will be the most important thing you ever do. We understand him, we understand God, and we understand our world. Because with the birth of Jesus, we see the long wait for God's people is over. And we look to him as the fulfillment of all his promises. And so tonight, on the eve of Christmas, it's right that we celebrate and sing about this great news. And so I'm going to invite the band up, and they're going to lead us in our next song.